the blood vessels below the skin, they dilate, and this causes drop in blood pressure, and the body tries to maintain the blood pressure by the heart pumping harder and pumping faster, which puts a strain on cardiac tissue. So what happens is it actually creates a demand supply mismatch of the coronary tissue, which can lead to ischemia, that is heart attack or stroke or heart failure. And there comes a stage when the body's thermoregulatory capacity exceeds, and because of that hyperthermia sets in, which means the body core temperature starts exceeding this range of 37.5 or 38, and there you start seeing cellular death, or there is a release of toxic chemicals, and there is a multi-organ failure. So your heart is affected, kidneys are affected, respiratory system is affected, every organ in the body gets affected. And what, so these are the wide spectrum of impacts that generally occur because of heat. But when we actually talk about heat, it is mostly the heat stroke, which is just the tip of the iceberg. And these other impacts like heart attack or renal failure or asthma, they are very difficult. Rather, I would say it is very difficult to establish the link of heat or heat as a causative factor behind that morbidity and mortality, which causes problem in data reporting. So if you go to the next slide, this is how it looks in terms of data gaps. So in 2023, if you look at the reported annual heat stroke deaths by the health surveillance in India, they were just 189. This is what gets reported in the media also. But if you look at the estimated deaths in that year, which were attributable to heat and which include all cardiac, renal, heat stroke, everything which is caused by heat, they were to the tune of 180,000. So this is the heat, the data gap that we are talking about, and this happens mainly because of the difficulties in understanding the linkage between the heat and the cause of death. And what you need to take then the resort, you need to take help of population level data or research. But unfortunately, in the research from India, you also see the similar gaps. So right now, in if you look at the any review from Indian literature, the morbidity caused by extreme heat in terms of cardiovascular, renal, or respiratory impacts, there is very little evidence about that. Similarly, there is little focus on how do people understand the heat risk or vulnerability. How do they cope in terms of adaptation intervention? What works, what doesn't, and what kind of long-term policies or systemic interventions would be useful to address this problem at a scale. So these are the gaps that we also see in the research, especially the heat health research that I'm talking about. So with this quick recap, I hand over to you, Rohit.
Thank you, Ritu, for opening the conversation there. I think a lot of things that you've touched on misattribution, on sort of us not having long-term systems, we'll get to it in the course of this webinar. But right now, coming to you, Nigar, your work tries to combine some of what Ritu was talking about of the heat that is experienced in the body with spatial mapping methods. So could you tell us a little bit about your use of bioclimatic indices? What does it mean, and how does it help the gaps that we have in measuring heat in the country?
Yeah, sure. So first, I would like to start with uh, discussing a specific concept called homeostasis. Basically, humans, whether they live in cold or hot climates, their internal body temperature or core body temperature is always expected to be between 36.4 and 37.2 degrees. So that is kind of the evolutionary mechanism which allows people to survive in harsh climates and so on. What happens is, in general, as Ritu has already mentioned, when the body finds it too hot, you have like some level of stimulus coming up from the skin and to the nervous system, and then and so on and so on. So you start sweating because it's too hot in order to cool the body and everything. But most importantly, you have to understand that heat stress, or in this sense, how does heat kill, comes down to the breakdown of this homeostasis. So homeostasis is like a balance. It's like equilibrium, right? So it's inside the body. It's always maintained, right, within this temperature. But unfortunately, why heat stress becomes so dangerous is because this balance gets destroyed in the process. And sometimes even sweating is not enough. Sometimes even increased blood flow and other things are not enough. So that is kind of what makes it so deadly. Can you go to the next slide? So this is something which I would like to discuss as how does heat kill? It comes down to how different organs operate at different core body temperatures. So we understand that homeostasis, like as I mentioned, the human body's balance is between 36.4 to 37.2 degrees, right? But when we go out into the sun, or when there's like a lot of heat in the environment, and also when we are working a lot, right? So that's when the body generates a lot of metabolic heat. So in this sense, whatever food we eat, more than 80% of the energy which is contained in that food comes out as heat, and this has to be removed from the body, and it's usually removed through the skin, or sometimes worst cases through sweat. We have to understand that in today's scenario, wherever you are in India, um, the question of heat stress is directly linked to the core body temperature. And in this sense, uh, we need to know that if there are certain symptoms which are happening to us, we should understand that it is a certain level of heat stress. And because of that, it could become very dangerous, or it is something which would demand rest and so on. So quickly running through the temperatures. At 38 degrees, you're going to have rashes and some level of swelling and sunburn and all that. 38.5 degrees, so that's the core body temperature, where your internal body is reaching a point where you get headache, thirst, or fatigue. You can have heart rate increase or stomach cramps. So this is like the baseline safe limit according to the World Health Organization, right? So for any worker or any person, if it crosses 38.5, it becomes a problem. But if you come down to 39, so that's when the body, the homeostasis is not able to sustain, so it becomes hotter inside the body. And then you move into the section of 39 where you have dizziness, poor decisions, and all of that. Muscle breakdown, heart rate increase, and mainly nausea and all that. Here, this is where you have a lot of sweating, and there's something which is related to cool skin or moist skin. This is important because in Chennai, or in most places, it gets very humid and hot. And getting to 39 is kind of where most of our life revolves around, right? But when you move to 39.5, this is where the danger comes in. So this is very comparable to alcohol, according to doctors, where the person kind of acts as if they are intoxicated, right? There's a lot of confusion. They get very angry. They can't see. It's a blurred vision. In Tamil, we call it gear. It's a common term used by auto drivers and bus drivers and many others, wherein they are driving in some level of trance, and there's so much aggression and so on. Plus you have again tachycardia. That would be your heart having palpitations or some level of pumping. You can feel it and all that. And finally, this is the danger stage. And I think most people, most workers, or most people, they once they come to the alcoholic stage or the 39.5 stage, they have a adrenaline spike, and this is why heat is so deadly. Because instead of fatigue, instead of resting, your body actually pushes you into a stage where you work more or you keep going, right? It's like a evolutionary defense. So because of this, after 39.5, your mind pushes you to keep going. And that's why you come into the heat stroke zone, which is the most dangerous zone, which is around 40 degrees. And here you have, apart from heat stroke, you can have seizures. Some people can go directly into coma. You can have hypertension, heart attacks, and heavy breathing, and all of that. And one last thing to add in this is when you cross into this point, yeah. So normal people would stop sweating, which kind of compounds the issue. And for workers, it would make them sweat more. And of course, the urine thing is also a part of it. So this is why we need indices which can talk about core body temperature, which can understand heat stress based on this rather than just mentioning temperature, humidity, and so on. Yeah.
Thanks, Nigar. And I hope that you'll also be able to tell us how you are using uh, some kind of special methods to sort of map a lot of what is happening at the city level and neighborhood level. But moving on, Rajesh, I want to come to you now. Um, you've done an analysis of Delhi's heat action plan and developed a case where you explain how heat is a wicked problem and how some of how we may be responding to it currently is just not sufficient. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about that?
Thanks. Um, I'm going to actually start with an anecdote. It's one of my earlier memories, in my now uh, more than I should count years of existence. I grew up in Delhi, and even in the 1980s, 70s, Delhi was a very hot place. And one of my first memories was this man staggering down our street. There was a tree right in front of my house, and he literally just collapsed face down in front of our house and just lay there. And then half an hour later, like my mom went down and other women went down and they gave him water. But he just lay there. He, I think, did not get up for at least an hour or more. And then finally, at some point, I saw him get up, lean against the tree, and then just sit there. And of course, it's not like I was just staring at him the entire time. But I remember that it was like half a day before he got up and left. And of course, people fed him and gave him water and all of those things. But this idea that heat is this dangerous thing has, like, it's a very visceral experience. And of course, as a kid who used to play in the dry heat of Delhi, it's something that we would always hear from parents and others that watch out, make sure you come home and drink water and go back and all of those things. So I want to talk about the lived experience of heat. As you can see, I kind of started doing that. And the wickedness of heat as a problem, at least for Socrates, starts from its lived experience. Of course, the statistics also bear it out. If Ritu's rather interesting statistic where you go from 189 recorded deaths due to heat to 180,000 deaths that are perhaps facilitated by heat is a factor of 1,000, right? And that tells you the kind of wickedness that heat as an analytic category presents to us. It's connected to so many other intersectional challenges. I mean, it's clearly tied to gender because often women work in front of stoves and other heat producing devices that only add to your heat stress. It, of course, is tied to class because it's often working class people and street vendors and others who face the brunt of heat. It is tied to age because children, so the two ends of the spectrum, both children and the elderly, are differentially affected by heat. So the wickedness of heat comes from how it's connected to so many other issues. And I think heat action plans, at least Delhi's heat action plan and the others that we looked at, didn't quite capture this intersectionality and wickedness of heat. But most importantly, I think from our perspective, they give, there's a famous book by James C. Scott, Seeing Like a State, right? And heat action plans are seeing heat like a state. And that's not what we want. We want it to be citizen centric. We want heat to be addressed from the point of view of the person who's experiencing heat and their needs, and work our way backwards from that. And heat action plans definitely are not citizen centric in that way. And maybe I can mention that in the future.
Thank you. It gives me a nice springboard to sort of jump to the next section. But just before that, I'd like to, thank the panelists. I think you brought some very interesting things for us to speak more about. Starting with Dr. Ritu, where you spoke about the staggering mismatch between reported and actual casualty due to heat, and Nigar continuing talking about the lack of attention to core body temperature, and that's why we need to put the effort. And finally, Rajesh's provocation, which lends itself to my next set of questions, that maybe the state attempt is to see heat as a state and not as a lived experience of people. So I'd like to spend the next few minutes talking about the different approaches that each of you are using to understand the effects of heat, especially at the micro or community scale, because we know that a lot of heat is captured at much larger scales, at the city scale, at the national scale. So just starting off with Ritu, can you take us through some of your uh, experiences with using qualitative approaches to understand heat stress, and what is that revealing, and how can they then help design better safety measures and adaptation programs? Yeah.
Sorry. Thanks, Rohit. Rajesh talked about this lived experience, and he also referred to the multi-systemic uh, characteristic that this challenge has. And because it has connections to different sectors, different departments, different systems as such, the inquiry or the examination of this issue can have multiple starting points. And we wanted to look at this issue from the community lens. And therefore, we have been doing this research among outdoor workers in Pune city, wherein we are using both qualitative as well as survey, that is quantitative methodology, to understand their risk perceptions, to understand the lived experiences of vulnerability as well as coping. So I'm going to take this case of street vendors, which was one of the subgroups that we studied from Pune, to elaborate the kind of learnings that this kind of approach helped us to gain insights. So as you see on your screen, this is a typical case of street vendor. Because they are outdoor workers, they have a very high exposure to extreme heat. Their adaptive capacity is very poor. There are no shades, their access to water, toilet, healthcare is very poor. And the economic precarity is very high because they are dependent on daily earnings. Many of them even operate without licenses. Very interestingly, there is that intersectionality angle to that. So, as a street vendor, it's a highly vulnerable group, and all our heat action plans talk about that. But even within that group, what we realize that depending upon who you are, the sensitivity, or I would say the vulnerability, is higher. So if it is a older street vendor, if it is a woman street vendor, if it is a street vendor with low literacy, their access to amenities and information is much lower, increasing their vulnerability. The other aspect was high prevalence of non-communicable diseases. So in our sample, almost 20% people say they were having diabetes, 20% or more than that, they said they had hypertension, which increases their risk of having heat health impacts. So when we were talking, the Niga was discussing about the various symptoms and the risk associated with the heat health outcomes. It is these people who have these pre-existing diseases of heart or kidney or diabetes or hypertension, they are at the highest risk. So we were interested in knowing how do they understand their own risk. So if you go to the next slide, uh, we try to understand how do they make sense of their heat, the risk of the heat, and it was definitely not by temperatures or through early warnings. It was their bodily experiences through which they were making sense of their risk, and they applied an economic framework to that. So they all of them had a very high burden of different symptoms. Not everyone had a same set of syndrome at a typical temperature threshold. It varies according to the exposure, according to your pre-existing illnesses and the kind of coping that behaviors that you are adopting. But essentially what they said was heat was troublesome when it adversely affects their bodily capacity to earn. That is how they understand the heat risk through that economic framework. And if you go to the next slide, there also was a health economy trap. So any adaptive behavior, whether it was drinking water or taking an afternoon break or putting up a shade, it was a financial liability to themselves. and which basically triggered an acute anticipation of future poverty. And with that learned helplessness, I would say, they prioritize the work over their health, continuing the vicious cycle of exposure and heat related risk. And next slide, please. How in this whole process they basically normalized their bodily experiences of heat related health symptoms, and this came from a place of acute helplessness as well as place of habituation, and that is very important for us to understand. So these are the kind of quotes that you can see. What they're saying is basically, we are tough enough, we are used to it, and nothing is going to happen to us, no matter what early warnings the state is issuing. So if you go to next slide, this whole context is very important to us when we are talking about programmatic responses. And now I'm only going to touch upon the communication. So right now, communication is mainly through early warnings or heat health advisory, and that is probably not sufficient because people have normalized their bodily experiences. So what we really need to reimagine how we want to communicate about heat health related risks, and you really can't have it in silos. It has to be complemented with the social protection, safety nets, and the structural solutions which are going to be specific for every subpopulation which is vulnerable to heat. So I think this is what actually helped both the qualitative and quantitative. This mixed method approach was very helpful for us to gain these insights. And I'll stop here, and Rohit, over to you.
Thanks, Ritu. Rajesh, would you like to come in here and tell us a little bit about the work of using transect walk and our neighborhood level heat mapping approaches?
Yeah, actually, I should say, Rohit, as one of the people who did those transact walks, it's almost better for you to talk about it. But hey, I'm the person on the spot. Uh, so what's interesting is how transect walks and our heat stories. So transect walk is a standard field exercise that people in urban planning, architecture, other such disciplines do. And we also interviewed people, street vendors, porva karmikas, and other street level workers, both in Bangalore and in Chennai. And in order to find out what their lived experience of heat is. So I'm going to again just tell one anecdote which came out during heat, neighborhood level heat convening we did last year, which is that if you're a street vendor, it would actually help you a lot to have an umbrella or some sort of shade device over your head. But it turns out that the police will not allow you to have that, right? So in Shantinagar, when we interviewed street vendors, we found out that the police are actually anything that adds to the comfort of the street vendor is something that the police are reluctant to allow, partly because maybe they don't want that street vendor to be regularized in any fashion, but maybe it is just a power dynamic. So the lived experience of heat is not just the lived experience of the temperature of heat, but also the lived experience of the social relations that structure heat. So maybe I'll end with that.
Nigar, taking this conversation a slightly different direction, but as having done the transect walk, I see a lot of sort of um, richness in the work that you're trying to do in spatially capturing some of this heat risk, especially at like scales that are smaller than cities and in neighborhoods. Can you tell us about what you've been doing? What are your experiments in different parts of Tamil Nadu suggesting?
Okay, thank you, Rohit. So, after moving towards more humanistic approaches to heat stress, right? So we wanted to find out if core body temperature is the most accurate way of measuring heat stress. Can we actually look at some methods in which we have some level of technical backing, which would support the conceptual understanding that heat stress can kill, and we need to have some level of scientific indices which can work on it, right? So that's why we use bioclimatic indices like UTCI and so on. So today, we're going to look at a case study which we've been working on. This is about the air show in Chennai, which happened in 2024. I think around 20 lakh people, they came together at the Marina Beach in Chennai, and at least 5 people died, and the official records don't exist, but thousands of people fainted. And all of this happened within like 2 hours. So within 2 hours, the people are they're just going to the Marina Beach. They're looking at the Air Force doing all the stunts and all of that. And within 2 hours, you have like mass paintings, which I think is something which was never seen before in the context of Chennai and all. And the reason, of course, was heat. And so we wanted to look at this incident to understand what was happening. So we looked at, can you go to the next slide? Yeah. So in order to understand this situation, we used the bioclimatic index, which integrates metabolic heat, which of course you can think of temperature and humidity being like the most used indices, let's say, and they combine to give wet bulb temperature and all of that. But here we are looking at UTCI, or the Universal Thermal Climate Index, where we look at the metabolic heat, how the body moves heat around, how blood flows, what kind of clothing was potentially there, apart from, of course, temperature, humidity, wind speed, and thermal radiation. And using this, we can model the core body temperature. That's kind of course, the most accurate way of understanding heat stress, right? And if UTSI crosses 38, it becomes a heat stroke zone or a very strong heat stress. And if it crosses like 46, 47, it's potentially fatal. So I don't think many other indices give you this flexibility to understand heat stroke itself. So if it hits 38, you should cease all work. And if it hits 46, it's better you stay indoors or something like that, right? Okay, you can go to the next slide. Right, so this is a person who died at the beach. His name was Karthikeyan. He's 38, I think. And he was at the beach for around 3 hours. He came there around 9:30 or so, and he dies around 9:30, 10, and he dies around 1:30. On the left side, you see that is a land surface temperature image of the Marina Beach, which I think is the most iconic place in Chennai. And you can see how the sand itself, it's so hot. Time to time, it heats up to 55, 60 degrees on a normal day. And this is where 20 lakh people almost were made to come and stand. And that is kind of because people currently we don't have any understanding of how heat stress works. And this beach, as you can see, the red, central red, sorry, the black and the yellow areas, they are hitting like 55 degrees. And this is where the people were standing. And the gray dot, that's where the CM was standing. Like the chief minister was there, Stalin was there. And we saw the core temperature progression of Karthikeyan within 3.5 hours was hitting 40 degrees, which is kind of the heat stroke limit, right? That's what we were talking about. So this means that this condition which existed can kill somebody within 2 hours or 3 hours. And that's what we are coming to. Next slide, next slide. Can you go to the next slide? Yes. And yeah, so this is like a UTCI map, which was done at 5-minute intervals, where you can see where the red dot, that's where Karthikeyan actually died. And the other regions, that's where the UTCI crosses 44.5, 44.9, and so on. So we kind of charted the route which Karthikeyan took and his activity, what was he up to. And we found out that within 3 hours, the UTCI, since it was so high, the urban heat island was increasing UTCI by 4 or 5 degrees, and the wind speed was, for some reason, very slow. And the person actually died within 3 hours of exposure. And this was in October. Please remember that this is in October, not in May or June. So you have to understand that something like a bioclimatic index is the next step, because we can understand these kind of deaths and we can, protect our people in a better way, I think. No, that's it. This is the next part. Sorry.
Thank you. I'll just quickly summarize what I'm hearing and go towards the final third of this session. So from Ritu, what I heard is that communicating heat, especially to people who seem to have normalized it on a day-to-day basis, that's where some of the work is. Rajesh, you also pointed out that heat is not only about the experience of it, but also draws on politics of identity, formality, a lot of things that we know as urban. And finally, Nigar, you pointed out that there are methods available, there are frameworks available for us to do more in terms of just understanding how we can protect people better. Uh, right. So in this last third, I'd like to spend some time talking about how states, urban local bodies, and neighborhood level action can strengthen the health focus in their heat planning. So starting with Ritu again, I'd like to ask you as a public health practitioner, what opportunities do you see for strengthening health focus in your heat action plans and any other measures?
Thank you, Rohit. I think as far as this neighborhood level or local responses, mainly from the health angle, one point I think I already talked about was health communication and how we need to reimagine that. In the sense of the indicators, like Nigar talk about the UTCI indicator, and they are really very useful indicators. What is very challenging for us is how do you translate the scientific understanding in a very simplified way so that people can actually use it in their day-to-day behaviors. Because similar to Marina Beach, there was another incident that occurred in Navi Mumbai, I remember 2 years back. And there was a lot of discussion about people coming from or traveling far distance to reach that event. And at that event, the water which was stored in tankers got very hot, and people were suffering from number of symptoms but did not understand the risk at the personal level. And we need to have better content as well as better channels of communication so that people perceive this risk in a better way. That is one part. Second part is, I think we have to focus on the morbidity aspect. So morbidity about these multisystemic impacts, whether it is renal, cardiovascular, or any other organ that is involved in the body. Because right now, if you look at the media or if you look at the surveillance related reporting, it kind of revolves around the heat stroke deaths. So we people read only about the heat stroke, which in many places is far and few to occur, and therefore that also kind of translates into how people perceive their own risk. That is one part. And the second part is there has to be more research about how much is the burden of these health outcomes, because it's not only about one cardiovascular death. Behind one cardiovascular death there are going to be number of hospital admissions, emergency admissions, out of pocket expenditure. So how much is the burden of that? Who is bearing the burden of that? These are some important questions for health research, heat health research. And third part is more from my experience of working from other public health issues. So public health challenge of this scale, what we have learned in the past is the interventions work the best if the communities are actively involved. And this is also going to be true for heat health interventions. And the communities can be involved in very different ways, more creatively, whether it is in community level health surveillance or health communication, or designing the context specific interventions at the local or the neighborhood level. That is what Transit Walks is all about, I suppose. So what we need to remember, that we need not look at vulnerable communities as passive recipients of some aid or some support. They should be seen as active agents of change, and our interventions need to be designed in that way so that we have more community participation, we have more platforms wherein communities can engage with the state and other players which are working on this issue. That's
Thanks, Ritu. At Socrates, we keep talking about collective wisdom and about how everyone knows something and it's about surfacing it. So, on that note, Rajesh, can you talk us through your imagination of how neighborhood level exercises or local level exercises of coming together can then inform, like, what's the pathway for it to inform city level and larger heat action?
I mean, partly it is. Oh, I am unmuted. I mean, first of all, I think that the idea that there is one heat action plan that is uniform across a city seems to be like why, right? Um, I mean that's again seeing like the state. I feel like if you had to see like the street, then you would have action plans that are at the street level that, for example, will differentiate between a child who is walking down the street to go to a school from a street vendor who is standing, say, under a tree the entire day. And we would work our way backwards from the demographics, right? So for example, if you take, say, construction workers, there would need to be a plan, there would need to be aspects of a heat action plan that are specific to their needs. And the need for shelter, the need for water, perhaps even heat insurance that would be offered in collaboration with the contractors and other employers in the construction industry, right? And so, to me, the way that local lived experience informs a heat action plan is that, first of all, the heat action plan should be centered around the actual people who experience heat and who invariably either live or work in a specific locality.
Rajesh, Nigar, coming to you finally. Um, you, you've, you've been a passionate advocate on sort of improving how we measure heat and how that can be used to sort of inform a lot of our, not just heat action plans, but heat adaptation programs across the country in general. So can you talk us through your thoughts on the use cases of bioclimatic measurement frameworks?
Sure. Could you just go to the slide, the one after the air show? Yeah, yeah. Something else. The previous one, Yeah. So I think so India, most of our warnings, or like the idea of heat warnings itself, comes from the IMD, right? So that's the India Meteorological Department. Um, but our methods are based out of the old British colonial methods, in the sense they measure the pressure, temperature, and humidity, right? And if you look at other parts of the world, like the US and some countries in Europe, they use temperature. They also use temperature and humidity. And also in Europe, you have the UTCI, which is already in function, right, in many countries. So why do we need to talk about this? So India is currently, you must have seen the news, it's the hottest country in the world. And around 2 lakh people die every year. I think Ritu already mentioned it was around 1,80,000. But the official estimates are only showing 0 to 1,000 per year. I think in 22 there were 0 deaths. So that is a big issue because the government is not taking account of the seriousness of the issue. And one important problem associated with this is the IMD does not include humidity or even, let's say, other indices, which would be more useful in finding out if heat was deadly or heat was dangerous and so on. And this is why you have people dying in thousands, and there is no actual way to find out how they died or what happened and so on. In a sense, that's why it is no way lesser than the COVID mortality issue. And it is a undeclared heat emergency because every summer we are losing more than 2 lakh people, and there is no way for them to warn us, even though there are systems which exist across the world which can help us find out. Okay, next slide, please. Right. So again, what do we need at this point? So we need a warning system, which I'm not talking about heat index. I'm not talking about wet bulb. We need something which uses a bioclimatic warning system where the human body and the heat stress it experiences, the core body temperature are included, right? And this needs to be scaled down. And for different vulnerable groups, there needs to be different alerts. and so on. And also the climate models. We need proper climate models which can actually characterize our environments, especially in cities, because cities turn into urban heat islands because of the construction and so on. We also need clear-cut information on our people, where like housing, transit conditions, working conditions, and health metrics. So why do we need all of these things? Because in many cases, people live in a persistent state of heat stress, right? So they travel in very hot conditions, then they work in hot conditions, then they come back home and it's really hot and warm nights. So they're not able to have like a proper healthy routine at all because their body is constantly in heat stress. And we need climate insurance and heat protection based on these indices so that you can actually take care of people. And finally, we need proper heat mortality recordings. We need to know how many people are dying in which part, and most importantly, each person who dies gets 4 lakhs from the government. But there is no data, so we don't know who's dying, and they are misclassified as something else. So there are a lot of things to be done apart from, of course, heat action plans, which were mentioned by the others. And the last final statement from me is climate change is making things really worse because why is it so hot now? Because temperature is rising, sure, but also the humidity is also increasing. And then you have a wind speed, which is also decreasing across many parts of India. And all of these things together are actually spiking heat stress. And that's why India suddenly, out of nowhere, it's becoming really, really hot. And the nights are really, really humid and so on. So I think this is a irreversible path, and we should plan for the next 50 or 100 years and not just work on mitigation, but also on adaptation, I think.
Thank you, Nigar. Um, Before I do a quick summary, I think there's maybe time for 2 questions. I can already see one in the Q&A box, but if there are other questions, then uh, I'm going to read this question out loud and feel free to take it, whichever one of you feels like. Uh, so Janvi is asking, uh, I understand the issue with the 15th Finance Commission not recommending heat wave as a notified disaster was partially due to the fact that the data on mortality and heat related illness was not agreed upon or quantified. So, what does it take to measure the differential effects of heat impacts on health, health impacts on heat, and how can that be quantified to push evidence-based policy making? Nigar, to Rajesh, do you have thoughts on this?
I'll try to answer it. First of all, we have to understand that at an individual level, at a case specific level, it is very challenging to attribute heat as a cause of death because there is no biomarker here. It's a clinical diagnosis which is also based on circumstantial evidence. And from there, that controversy about what is the cause or whether it should be notified or not or accepted or not, it comes. That controversy arises from there. Second part is what the question is about what how can we quantify to push the evidence, and I think what because it's a very complex situation, we need to triangulate evidence coming in from lived experiences of people. There's no reason to underestimate this source of the information. It's an important source of information. Second is surveillance. The surveillance right now, which is being floated by Ministry of Health, is mostly in the public sector, and a large number of vulnerable community, especially all the outdoor workers or people from low income settings, they access care in private sector, especially the primary healthcare sector, which is the first contact point for people with the health system. And therefore, how can we include private players into the surveillance? How do we strengthen the surveillance? How do we put the data about not just heat stroke, but also about cardiovascular and respiratory and renal mortality, which is captured through surveillance? These are all the points that we need to discuss. And the third issue is of the research. And I already talked about we need to have more research on the morbidity aspects and the mortality caused by this multi-system failure. So right now, people are using this indicator of all-cause mortality, and there have been at least more than 10 cities where this kind of research is being done in the past. What they look at is what is the risk at different temperature thresholds in a city, wherein the mortality risk is very high. Now, the problem with this is not every city in India have this data which is accessible to the researchers, or that data may not be in good condition for the research to be utilized. And so we need to have this system strengthened, wherein the health outcome data on whether it is all-cause mortality or morbidity which is regularly captured in these health institutions, is readily available for the research. And the indicators that we just talked about, whether it is UTCI or other temperature thresholds, which also include the aspects related to humidity and wind speed and so on, they need to be validated in the Indian settings, because UTCI right now is validated mainly for the developed countries. We need to have more research to validate these thresholds in different cities, and they differ across cities, to know what kind of thresholds we are talking about and what kind of risks we are talking about. But at the end of it, I think I'll say it is always going to be the triangulation of data coming in from different sources, and people themselves are also an important source of information.
I can just add to that point because I don't think we have another question. So I was speaking to a doctor who was working in nephrology, and they were mentioning there were some heat shock proteins. Is that the right word? HSPs, I think. And there are different heat shock proteins which are released in the body based on the level of heat stress. Some are temporary, as in they disappear very soon, but some are there for a few days and so on. And they were talking about researching into finding if we can measure these heat shock proteins once someone dies, once someone is unwell, and we can probably use that as a biomarker to check if it was a heat mortality or not. Again, this is all very experimental. It's nowhere near practical. And data is a huge issue. Ritu was so right. The data, I don't know, there's almost no data on what's happening. And even if they do, it's very hard to connect it to heat itself. That becomes a huge issue. And we need to, yeah, figure out some ways.
We've got two more questions. I'll ask them together. One we have from Kalaivani on how important is heat health communication in the public health realm, because urban and rural definitions of heat and their lived experience might differ. And we've also got one question from, I think, Krishna, who's asked about the UHI effect and how do the panelists think about urban green spaces, trees on sidewalks in general, non-concrete spaces, and their role in cooling the city.
I think I could go with the first one. Maybe the others can take. About the question of moving beyond heat action plans, I think we should ensure that the warning systems or the awareness, the education itself is made into like a public movement, let's say, or at the very least, the government should take a proper uh, efforts to teach it at schools, to bring it in public media, to bring it in broadcast systems, and all of that. At the same time, I think there is still a lot of misconceptions on heat itself. And when you talk about urban, rural, and so on, even in Tamil Nadu, mostly Chennai gets a lot of attention on so hot and so on. But there are other parts of Tamil Nadu which basically get no alerts, there's no data, and so on. So I think there is a lot of work which needs to be done. But I think the core philosophy needs to be finalized that we have to protect people, we have to save each and every life, and we should not get lost in the jargon, right? Like just talking about heat action plan for the last 10 years or just saying cool roof for every issue. That's not going to work out. We need something which is very solid, and we need experiments, we need research, we need proper work. And I think this is the time that we should push it forward. I think that's what I would like to say.
I'll take that question on health communication from the public health aspect. And I think I've already talked about it a little bit. So again, referring back to that is one thing is if people feel that they are used to heat just because they have been sitting in extreme heat condition forever and nothing has happened to them, and so they believe that nothing will happen to them. Also because they are very helpless about the whole situation. These are the two things that needs to be influenced through communication. And I'm not really very sure whether only telling them information about a certain threshold has been crossed and you better take care would be helpful or not. And in that sense, I feel that the heat health communication needs to be reimagined, wherein people are better, we can build their abilities to understand what does that risk means to them at what level. So they can even refer to their bodily symptoms, which are the red flag signs that they can refer to, so that they know when to stop and what kind of actions they can take. And also they can demand whatever solutions are more specific to their context to the local governance mechanisms. So the communication also can achieve this aspect. And of course, public health machinery is a good platform to pass on this health communication. And this should definitely go beyond episodic prescriptive communication. Like do this, do that. How do you say a street vendor that don't work in an afternoon? So that message will have to be tailored so that he understand what kind of actions that he can take within the given context that that person is working in, and also trying to negotiate with the administration to provide for certain support or social protection mechanisms. And I think the more continuous communication in the form of a dialogue through trusted channels, and these trusted channels could be community volunteers, they could be ashas, anganwadis, or even the health department itself, which should be, in good terms, they should be exploited well, is what I think.
Thank you. I'm cognizant of time and I can see that questions are flooding in now. But I invite everyone who sort of put their questions to sort of write to us and we can pass it out to the panelists. But we unfortunately have to close for the day. But before that, I'd just like to maybe spend 30 seconds on reflecting on what I've taken from the session. Ritu, you very rightly pointed out that this is not an information dissemination game and that there is so much more to communication that needs to be reimagined. What works? How are people receiving that information? So I think there's plenty of work to be done there. You use the word reimagining communication. Rajesh, I am taking your phrase of seeing like a street and going beyond maybe a monolithic or like a single heat action plan for this for a city and thinking beyond how we can go beyond that. And Nigar, your sort of statement on how we need to prepare for a persistent state of heat stress, I think that stands very strongly with me, and we need to protect everyone. I think that's the work that needs to be done. And there's so much of data work that needs to be done, communication work, mapping work. So we have plenty of practitioners who are sort of tuning in today. I hope they're sort of going to take up some of the things that were said out loud. That being said, I'd like to thank the panelists for joining us today and sharing all these valuable insights with us. Thank you all to the participants for tuning in and for asking the questions. We hope to see you again soon in our next webinar series. In the meanwhile, if you're working on heat and you're looking to collaborate, please write to us at connectedsocrates.org. One of our team members will put it on the chat. But thank you. Have a wonderful day. And yeah, I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Rohit, and thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much. Thank you, everyone.